How many words is reasonable to learn in a day? Will focusing on radicals make this easier? And should you learn simplified or traditional characters, or maybe both? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. This week's episode is a listener and reader Q&A, where I will answer questions about learning vocabulary in Chinese. The reason I have chosen to focus on questions about vocabulary this week is because we have a vocabulary challenge for December. It starts on December 10th and lasts until the end of the month, and this is a great opportunity to consolidate things you've learned throughout the year, or maybe expand beyond that if you have time and energy to do so. Joining the challenge is completely free as usual, and you just head over to challenges.hackingchinese.com, and even if it's not December 2023 when you are listening, you can still head over to challenges.hackingchinese.com to check what challenge is on when you are listening. For this vocabulary challenge, we have some nice prizes available from Skritter. First, anybody who wants to check out Skritter can do so for free for the duration of the challenge, and to get the code to do that, you just look in the written article that comes with this episode. See the podcast show notes. This means that you get full access to all the premium features in Skritter during the challenge. So for example, you could check out the character course I helped build, or if you are not a beginner, you can check out some of the more advanced courses focusing on vocabulary. Second, 6 participants will also receive 3-month subscriptions for free, and this includes if you're already using Skritter, and I will give out these randomly, but weighted towards people who participate actively in the challenge and contribute in various ways. For more information about all this, check the show notes, and don't forget to use my discount code, which will also give you 10% off Skritter if you decide to stay. This will also help support Hacking Chinese and this podcast. Let's continue with the Q&A session, and as I said, this will focus on vocabulary. The first question is about how many words is reasonable to learn in a day. The second one is about radicals, and if learning radicals will help with vocabulary acquisition. And then finally, the third question is about whether you should learn simplified or traditional characters. As usual, I paraphrase the original questions a little bit to make them easier and more to the point, and also maybe applicable to a larger part of the audience. This first question is from Keith, and it's about how many Chinese words he should learn in a day. He gives some details here about his study situation, but like I said, I don't want to answer only one person's question here. I want to try to answer this question for many students at once, so let's be a little bit more general first. The problem is, of course, that it's very hard to be general when it comes to how many words you should learn. It depends on so many different factors. For example, how much do you study? If you study full-time, the answer will obviously be that you can learn more words than if you study 2 hours a week. It also matters greatly what you mean by learn, and I'm not trying to be obnoxious here and just ask what do you mean by this and try to define every part of the question to make it sound very hard to answer. It's because it really does matter. For example, do you include handwriting? Because learning a new word, if we count everything, so including, say, the pronunciation, some meanings, how it is used, and then also how it is written by hand, that is a different task from if you just need to recognize the spoken word, for example. That would be many times faster than doing all the things that I listed before. Keith is in what sounds like a fairly standard course though, and I think many listeners are. And in that case, you are required to learn all these things. So maybe you will have a test and you will be tested on pinyin, how to write by hand, and the meaning of the characters. Maybe not how to use them in specific sentences and so on, but at least the basics. Another complicating factor is what you do apart from learning words, because obviously learning a language is not just about increasing your vocabulary. You also need to listen, speak, read, and write, and these should take up much more time than vocabulary learning, at least if we mean vocabulary learning such as using a flashcard app or something like that. For more about flashcards, check last week's episode, that was 173, and you can also check next week's episode when that comes out, where we will talk about the downsides of relying too much on flashcards. One of the downsides that I will talk about in that episode is about counting the right things. Because if you have a number that represents how big your vocabulary is, it's very easy to make the mistake of thinking that this represents your Chinese level in general, but this is obviously not the case. Like I said, learning a language is about a lot more than just learning words. I also think it matters where you get the words from. Are you just downloading a list from the internet and trying to learn everything in that list, such as one of the HSK lists maybe? Then I think you should reconsider. I think that's a pretty bad idea, something I talked about more in episode 140. And also in episode 96, which was more in general about which words you should learn and where they come from. But assuming now that you go through a course, you get some words from your textbook, and maybe you're listening and reading beyond that, and you get some extra words, and you're curious about how many words should you learn, or indeed could you learn. I will try to answer this question, even though I think it should be clear by now why I think that counting the number of words and making a lot out of this number is not a good idea. It can mean anything depending on your situation. But still, I've taught a lot of Chinese, I've also learned Chinese myself, so I know a little bit about how much students learn and how quickly. For example, when I teach students at university here, they are studying full-time, and that means that they are supposed to spend 40 hours a week, and even if they don't have 40 hours of lessons, they still have quite a number of lessons and a lot of things to do beyond that. They learn something like 2,000 words in their first year, and this is just from the textbooks that they are covering, and I'm sure that most students actually learn more than this from other sources and things that aren't really counted in the textbooks and so on. But of course, then again, they also forget things, but at least I think they try to learn at least 2,000 words in roughly 40 weeks. This means 50 words per week, which is roughly what you will encounter in most standard textbooks per chapter, and this is not unreasonable if you study full-time. In fact, I think you can ramp this up quite a lot if you're serious and you know what you're doing. I once tried to learn 2,000 words in 5 days, and that actually worked. But of course, I already knew how the Chinese writing system worked, I knew a ton of characters, and I also knew how to learn these characters. I had all these systems in place and all the habits and so on. I'm not saying that most people will be able to do this, or even should do this. It's maybe not even a good idea. I did this just to see if it were possible, and I'll put a link in the description to an article where I talk more about how I did this and how it works. As I've said many times now, learning more words is not necessarily a good idea. How good you are at Chinese is to a large extent determined by how well you are able to use the things that you do know, not just how many things you know. So to answer Keith's question, I think that adding something like 5 words per day is not unreasonable if you're studying full-time, but you can go a little bit beyond this sometimes too. But you shouldn't just add words because you can. You should always make sure to add words you really want to learn for some reason or really need to learn. Maybe they come from your textbook, so your teacher essentially forces you to learn them, or it's something you've encountered in your own reading or listening that you really want to learn. So focus on these words. Before we move on to the next question, I'd also like to warn against adding too many words at once. For example, when I said 5 words per day, that doesn't sound like much, but if you do that consistently over a long period of time, you will build up a serious amount of reviews that you need to do in your flashcard app, and this is already taking up a lot of your time, and like I said, you should also listen, speak, read and write beyond this, and explicit vocabulary acquisition like this shouldn't take up more than a small fraction of your total study time. I know it's very tempting, especially if you're a beginner, to say 5. I can easily do 5. Why not do 10? Why not do 15 or 20? But if you do that and you keep on doing that, you will end up spending all your time in your flashcard app a few weeks from now reviewing all those words that you learned. And if you're not reviewing them in some way, either in the app or by reading or something, you shouldn't really have invested the time to learn them in the first place. It's just better to focus on fewer words and do it properly. So resist the urge. If you have a large review queue or have already added the 5 words you were supposed to add today, do something else instead. Read a little bit, go and listen to a podcast, but don't add more words. Naturally, it goes without saying that all the numbers I've mentioned here can roughly be scaled down to any other study situation. If you're studying half-time, for example, then halve the numbers that I've been talking about here. If you're studying only a few hours a week, you need to be very careful with flashcard apps so they don't take up all your study time, and adding words should not be a priority. Make sure you review what you have focused on earlier and then read and listen more. That will probably bring you further. And once in a while, when you encounter important words, do add them, of course. But having a numerical goal for how many words to learn per day doesn't make much sense, I think. Okay, moving on to the second question, which is from Ariella, and this is about radicals and whether or not it's a good idea to focus on them. I don't know the background to this question, but if you go online and check various forums and the like, it's not hard to find questions about whether or not you should focus on radicals, and some people will say it's a waste of time, some people will say you probably don't know what a radical is, and other people will just say yes, you should. So which one is it? Well, let's sort out the definitions first, because the answer to this question depends on what you mean when you ask it. I think I know what Ariella means, but some of the answers that she will get if she asks this online will assume that she means something else. So let's sort that out. The word radical is 部首 in Chinese, and 部 means part or section, and 首 means head. And so 部首 then means section head, or it's literally the heading of a section in a dictionary. So, for example, if you wanted to look up a character you didn't know how it was pronounced or what it meant in a character dictionary, you would identify the radical, you would go to that section in the dictionary, and you would find it by counting the number of strokes outside of the radical itself. This method is hardly used today, and I would argue that it's completely useless for most students to learn how to do this. Instead, we rely on dictionaries sorted by pronunciation, and if you don't know the pronunciation, you can still just use a digital dictionary, which will allow you to do this instantly without having to bother with radicals at all. So, the definition of a radical here is that it is the component or the part of the character that is used to sort it in a dictionary. It follows then that there can only be one radical per character, because otherwise you wouldn't know which one it was sorted by, and then it would be kind of pointless. In other words, it is a function that a specific component in a character has in that character. For example, if we take the word 椅子, meaning chair, and we look at the first character, we can see that there is a tree on the left, a mu, and this is the radical in I. So if you were to look this up in a traditional dictionary, you would go to the section with mu, tree, and you would then look for the character in that section of the dictionary. This does not mean that it is the radical in all the characters it appears in, however. So for example, in the character xiu, which means to rest, we have a person on the left, ren, and then we have a mu, tree, on the right. And here the radical is the person, it is not the tree. Therefore, it is incorrect to say that mu is a radical in xiu. It's actually wrong for two reasons. First, you don't say a radical in this character, because there can only be one, so say the radical instead. And second, it is incorrect because the radical is ren, not mu. So the key insight here is that Ariella and 99% of students who ask questions about radicals actually don't mean radicals. They mean character components or smaller parts of characters, whether or not they are radicals. That is besides the point. This can be rather confusing because even some scholars sometimes in English use the word radical to mean character component, so they might, for example, talk about semantic radicals and phonetic radicals, which certainly does confuse things quite a lot. The better word here is just component. It is neutral and can refer to any type of component in a character. And if you want to talk about this in Chinese, you can use the word 部件 instead of 部首, that means radical. So having said that, we can say that the correct, although very pedantic, answer to Ariella's question of whether or not she should focus on radicals is no, you should not. But this is deeply unhelpful because this was obviously not what Ariella had in mind when she asked the question. So if we assume that most students, when they ask about radicals, actually mean character components, we can say that the answer then is yes, you should use radicals, or character components if you want to use a better term. You can even say that yes, it's useful to learn radicals, but not because they are radicals. They are useful because they also happen to be common semantic components, usually. Looking at a list of radicals is a decent way of figuring out some of the most common semantic components, but again, they are not useful because they are radicals. They are useful because they also happen to be common semantic components. There are at least two problems with such lists, however. First, they include many components that are actually not very common, they just happen to be radicals in some quite rare characters. Second, they don't include all the components you need, just those that happen to be used as radicals as well. To get around the first problem, I created a list a while back that contains only the truly useful radicals, and I will link to this in the description. It's still one of the most popular articles on hacking Chinese, and that is probably because lots of people, like Ariella, learn about Chinese characters, they know there's something called radicals, and they want to know if they are useful and how to use them. So yes, you should definitely learn the components of characters, whether they are radicals or not. You shouldn't necessarily learn everything at once, so don't break down every single character you encounter to learn all the smallest components all the time, because this will make progress very slow. But you can use something like the rule of 3, so when you see a component the third time, then you look it up, but if you only see it once or twice, you just let it be. I also suggest that you brush up your knowledge about how the Chinese writing system works, how smaller components can be combined into larger compounds and so on, because this will make learning characters immensely easier than if you just look at them as a jumble of strokes. I've written about this a lot on Hacking Chinese, and I suggest you start with an article called The Building Blocks of Chinese, Part 1, Chinese Characters and Words in a Nutshell. And that will also link you to lots of other articles if you want to read more. Of course, you could also just check out the character course I built for Skritter, which contains all of these things in nice video format. This brings us to the third and final question, which is about learning simplified or traditional Chinese. It is from Simon, who has learned some Chinese but only focused on the spoken language so far. And he now wants to know if he is going to start learning Chinese characters, should he focus on simplified or traditional? And before I discuss this in more detail, I want to mention again that the reason I'm talking about different factors, what this decision depends on and so on, is not because there isn't a simple answer for the specific student, Simon in this question. I could give him a one-word answer, which is simplified, and that would be the end of the question. However, that assumes that you as a listener also knows about his background and his specific situation, which you don't because I haven't detailed it here. And I want this to be useful not just for Simon, but for everybody. So if you are in a situation where you're thinking about simplified and traditional, I want this to be helpful for you as well. And for that to be possible, I need to discuss the factors that influence the answer before I actually give the answer. So let's do that. I think we can use 3 different perspectives on this question, and one is pedagogical, one is practical, and one is personal. So when I say pedagogical here, I mean what makes sense from a learning efficiency point of view, which one is easiest, which one gives you the smoothest learning curve, and things like that. Here I don't think it makes much difference which one you start with. The only thing I'm reasonably sure of is that you shouldn't learn both at once, and the reason for this is that there is really no need to. You can focus on one of the sets, and then later you will realize that learning the other one is actually very easy. Yes, they look very different if you cherry-pick examples. You take the most complex traditional characters and you compare them to their simplified counterparts, and you think, oh, these are actually 2 different languages. I will learn one and then not be able to read the other, and so on. This is actually not true. If you learn one of them, you can basically read the other without much practice, and if you do invest some effort, you can actually be quite proficient in both, at least for reading and typing, and this is what most people want anyway. I do want to debunk the claim that simplified characters are simpler to learn. Well, I mean, it sounds like they are simpler, and if you look at them, you'd think that, okay, fewer strokes means that this character is easier to learn. Well, it certainly is faster to write by hand if you know the character. I mean, there are fewer strokes, that goes without saying. But that does not mean that it's easier to type or read. That's a completely different thing, and there is zero reason to believe that fewer strokes means that this suddenly becomes easier. In fact, I do think there are more reasons to think that traditional characters are actually easier to read and type compared to simplified, and that is because they are often more transparent. And what I mean by that is, for example, that the meaning and sound components are more visible, and there aren't many shorthand forms used that hide the etymology of the character, as it were. Just to mention one example, we have the character component yo, which means right hand, and it's written like a cross with the tops of the cross joined together. This component is very common in simplified Chinese, but it almost never tells you anything about the origin of the character or why it's there, because it's actually used to replace a more complex component that maybe would have given you information about the meaning or the sound. If you want more examples like this and a more in-depth discussion about simplified and traditional characters, you can check out a guest post on Hacking Chinese written by Ash Henson from Outlier Linguistics, and of course I'll put a link to this in the description. So to summarize, from a pedagogical standpoint, I don't think it matters much which you choose. You can do either. And this means that in order to answer the question which you should use, we need to look at other factors. So let's look at some practical factors. The first one is learning materials, because most textbooks and online apps and so on focus on simplified first. Maybe they do also offer traditional, sometimes not, and if they do, it's usually auto-converted by a computer and it might contain more errors and so on. And this is something to take into account, because if you go with simplified, it will just be easier to find learning materials. And I know this as someone who has spent most of my time with traditional characters and at times have been rather annoyed by finding a nice app for learning vocabulary, say, and then realizing that no, they don't support traditional. The same is of course true for all other types of learning content, including graded readers, textbooks, and so on. So in this regard, it's a win for simplified characters. They are more widely used, more people use them in the world, and more students also use simplified, meaning that you will have an easier time finding the learning materials you want. This means that I think most students should start with simplified Chinese before they learn traditional, and this is not because it's better, faster, or something like that. It's just because it's more practical, it's easier to find learning materials, and that makes a big difference. Of course, more people in the world use simplified, so you will also find it easier to communicate with Chinese people. However, I also think it's very important to take personal factors into account here. What do you like? What do you want to learn? If you have a strong preference for traditional characters, maybe because you think they look nice or something else, by all means learn traditional first. That also works, no problem. Similarly, if you, for example, want to live in Taiwan or already live in Taiwan where everybody uses traditional, then of course you should learn traditional first. That kind of goes without saying. Again, this is not because traditional characters are better, it's just that the argument I used for saying that simplified are better for most people, i.e. that it's more practical, simply doesn't apply if you're surrounded by traditional characters where you live or where you want to live. So in the end, it's up to you. You can do either simplified or traditional. Eventually, I think most students will learn both, as it is not very difficult once you've mastered one of the sets. Which one you start with makes very little difference, but if I had to choose one without knowing who you are, I would say it makes more sense to learn simplified just because it's more practical. So those were 3 questions about learning vocabulary in Chinese. If you have any questions, not necessarily related to learning vocabulary specifically, you can just write to me at editor@hackingchinese.com and I might try to answer your question in an upcoming episode. In the meantime, I hope to see you in the vocabulary challenge and in next week's episode, where we will talk about the downsides of relying too much on flashcards. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.